Hey everyone, this is Philip Anthony Albertelli, and this is The Week in Doubt, a podcast for atheists, agnostics, and whoever. Episode 30. Quickly before we start, I'd like to apologize for the glitches in episode 29. About halfway through, you probably noticed this really annoying and persistent white noise. So my apologies for that. And also, I'd like to give a shout out to C Web Sunday School. Chris Webber's a fellow podcaster and a fellow non-believer. He's seems like a really good guy, and I listened to his podcast and I enjoyed it. So I just thought that I would give it a plug. Don't get so enamored that you forget to listen to The Week in Doubt, though. Okay. So today's episode is going to be about the destruction of the Second Temple back in 70 AD, and whether or not Jesus's prophecy or prophecies about the destruction of the temple were true prophecies or if they were inventions of the gospel writers after the temple's destruction, kind of a prophecy in retrospect. Before I get into debating whether or not Jesus actually predicted the destruction of the Second Temple, I'll give a brief history of the temple in general. The reason why it's called the Second Temple is because the first temple was destroyed. The first temple, or Solomon's temple, was supposedly constructed during the reign of the biblical King Solomon in the 10th century BCE, or before Common Era. But there is a 2nd century Jewish chronology known as the Seder Olam Rabbah that actually puts the construction of the temple a little later, around the 9th century BCE. It goes without saying that the temple was considered an extremely important and holy building dedicated to Yahweh and supposedly housing the legendary Ark of the Covenant. On a side note, there is kind of this cool little apocryphal or outside book known as the Testament of Solomon that tells a story about Solomon actually using a ring to command demons in order to build the temple for him. I remember listening to at least one biblical scholar kind of comparing it to the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings. But that's neither here nor there. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Judah and Jerusalem and initiated what is known as the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity. When the first temple was destroyed, according to secular history, would have been about 586 or 587 BCE, and the Jewish people were driven or taken out of their homeland of Judah. And this would be, I believe, the first diaspora in Jewish history. Anyone who's familiar with the history of the Jewish people knows that as a people, they went through some exceptionally hard times, to say the least. There was the Babylonian diaspora. Then after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, the Jewish people were scattered again, and then that eventually would lead to all the hardships that the Jewish people had to face in Europe throughout the centuries. In 538 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia came to power and ended the Babylonian captivity and allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland. The Jewish people quickly set to rebuilding the temple, and supposedly by 516 BCE, it was ready for consecration. Now we're going to take a big leap forward into the 1st century AD or CE, Common Era, when the infamous King Herod of the Bible had begun reconstruction of the temple. In 66 AD, the Jewish people rebelled against the occupying Romans, And 4 years later, in 70 AD, under Titus, the Romans destroyed much of Jerusalem and destroyed most of the Second Temple. And there's a famous work of art you may have seen at some point in documentaries, etc., known as the Arch of Titus. It was erected to celebrate the victory of Titus in Judea, and it's an iconic image. It shows a Roman procession carrying loot taken from the temple, including a menorah. So even though the temple and much of Jerusalem had been razed, there still were Jewish occupants in Judea. And in the second century, and I was kind of wanting to talk about this, there was what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Bar Kokhba is a very kind of fascinating figure that a lot of people probably don't know about. Supposedly, he was the Jewish Messiah. Um, so here we are in the second century, long after the death of Christ. And obviously, one of the main, even though Christianity was essentially a Jewish religion, Jesus was Jewish, his followers were Jewish. Um, but of course, the movement following Jesus during his lifetime and shortly after, it wouldn't have been considered Christianity. Christ, Christos, is a Greek word for anointed one or something to that effect. And historians call this essentially Jewish movement the Jesus movement. And when what we would call Christianity, for lack of a better term, spread from Judea into the classical world, into Greece and Rome, it was still considered a Jewish movement and a form of Judaism. And I believe at the time, if Gentiles wanted to become Christians, in a sense, they first had to convert to Judaism. And we get into debates about whether or not someone who converts to Christianity should have to be circumcised or whatnot. And Paul, of course, formerly Saul of Tarsus, ends up deciding that no, you don't have to physically be circumcised in order to become a Christian. All you need to be is circumcised in your heart, as odd as that sounds. But it's obviously a metaphor for you don't need to mark your flesh. You need to be devoted in your heart. But anyway, obviously the key difference between what we now call Christianity and Judaism was a disagreement about the Messiah. And it may be somewhat shocking to devout Christian ears, but there were other people claiming to be the Messiah other than Jesus, and Bar Kokhba was one of them. He wasn't a contemporary of Jesus. This was some time after. And to this day, we still have coins that you can view that have inscriptions about Bar Kokhba on them from the time. And Bar Kokhba was more in keeping with the traditional view of what a Jewish Messiah was supposed to be. It must have been quite a shock in a way when those who thought Jesus was the Messiah, when his story ended with him, well, if you're a believer, you believe the story didn't end with the crucifixion, obviously. But when Jesus's mortal life, at least, shall we say, ended with a humiliating death on the cross. Because in Jewish thinking, a Messiah was supposed to be a warrior, a conqueror, similar to King David. And Bar Kokhba more fit this mold. But unfortunately, Bar Kokhba too was overcome by the Romans, and his revolt was quashed. But I just thought that was an interesting side note. I think the first time you hear about this other early figure who is supposedly the Jewish Messiah. It causes a lot of people's jaws to drop. So now I've given a brief history of the temple, including the destruction of the second temple. So now on to the question I posited at the beginning of the episode. Did Jesus really predict the destruction of the temple in his lifetime, or is this the creation or literary device of one or more of the gospel writers, a kind of prophecy in retrospect? But I suppose I should start with the New Testament quotes that refer to the temple's destruction. There's Mark 13:2 and Matthew 24:2, which are very similar. In the New American Standard Bible, Mark 13:2 says, "And Jesus said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down.'" And in Matthew 24:2, "And he said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down.'" Well, I think before we can try to establish whether or not Jesus really predicted the fall of the temple, we first have to try to establish when the Gospels that contain these predictions were written. And not that long ago, I did an episode on biblical translation that focused on the ideas and works of Dr. Bart D. Ehrman. And as he says, we don't even have the originals. We have copies of copies because the originals were lost. Either they were worn out, or, as crazy as it sounds, discarded or lost, and kind of newer, fresher copies were preferred over them, perhaps. So it can be hard to try to date the originals when we don't even have the originals. But right now I'm on a website called stellarhousepublishing.com, and they have an article on gospel dates. And here's a little, well, I guess they publish various books by theologians. And right here, it seems like they're advertising one. Well, no, I wouldn't say advertising. It doesn't look like necessarily trying to sell it to you, but they're showing a list of different books. And one is called "Who Was Jesus? Fingerprints of Christ" by D.M. Murdoch. And then underneath there's a section on gospel dates, and it has a quote. "It's important to acknowledge that, strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous." And that's a quote by Dr. Craig L. Blomberg, author of a book called The Case for Christ. And I think that's true, that in a sense the Gospels are anonymous. We're not sure who wrote them. I think different theologians have different ideas or opinions, but generally speaking, we say almost like dedications. Certain names have been attributed to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we don't know who the original author was. And this article goes on to talk about how the Gospels have been dated variously, from shortly after the crucifixion, traditionally placed around 30 AD CE, to as late as a century and a half afterwards. Then it gives a list of currently accepted dates, and it gives 2 dates for each Gospel. The closer to the eyewitness period would be a date embraced by conservative believing scholars, and the later date, a date more favored by liberal or secular scholars. So Matthew and Mark, the 2 that I was just quoting, the Gospel of Matthew, conservative theologians like to place it around 37 AD or CE, where the more liberal view is it could have been written as late as 100 AD. Mark, those who try to get it as close as they can to the eyewitness period, put it at the best 40 AD. So that'd be roughly like a decade or less after the death of Christ. But more secular scholars place it at 73 AD. And just with my experience with reading up on the Gospels and how different theologians tend to date them, it seems like there's usually some kind of intellectual gymnastics involved in trying to get the uh, dates of the canonical Gospels close to the eyewitness period. Um, where the latter dates, secular, yes, but also I'd say probably the more reasonable and realistic estimate of when they were written. So Matthew and Mark, I believe, even though Matthew comes first, Mark is considered the oldest of the four canonical Gospels. So the secular date is 73, which would be 3 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. Matthew, the secular view, is 100 AD, which would be almost, no, which would be just about 3 decades after the destruction of the temple. Well, personally, and I know anyone who's familiar with the show or even new to the show, as you can probably just judge from the cover art, I'm a non believer. Um, so I tend not to believe in things like prophecies or other supernatural phenomena or events. So for me, the fact that the safer, more secular dates do take us after the temple's destruction. And seeing as I have a kind of reason based worldview, I don't believe in prophecy, etc. It seems to me it's more likely that the gospel writers um, created the story of Jesus' prediction of the fall of the temple after the fact. Um, I'm not saying that they were being deceptive or anything like that. As I've talked about on the show before, the different gospel writers wrote for their specific communities and tailoring the needs of their communities. It could be the case that we had gospels being written for Jews that had witnessed the destruction of their homeland, witnessed the destruction of the temple. So there could be something kind of significant or consoling in having Jesus have prophesied or prophesized the destruction of the temple. I know I've heard some weird kind of weak excuses from Christian apologists concerning the nature of Jesus's prophecies and whether or not they were real, whether or not they were added after the fact, but whether the prophecies were literary devices of the gospel writers, whether it's something that Jesus actually said during his lifetime. And one of them has to do with Jesus, how he seems to be talking about, the end of days and the coming of the kingdom. And I think, I almost said the end of the world, but I caught myself a bit because I think there's this misunderstanding where when Christians think about the end of the world, they think about the actual destruction of the world, where ancient Jews and even adherents of Jesus, the first Christians, may not have been expecting an actual physical destruction of the world, but whether a great change and shift, a new coming era of justice and God's rulership on the world, the kingdom of heaven on the earth as it was. But obviously, if we look at the book of Revelation, I talk about how it was written by John of Patmos and how it almost didn't make it into the canonical Bible. And that seems to be a more apocalyptic type of book where it's a bit more lurid and filled with violent imagery than the anything you find elsewhere in the New Testament. And that's another thing, people associate the word apocalyptic with the end of the world, with destruction, when it actually, when you translate it um, from the Greek into English, means something more like the lifting of the veil, or an unveiling, or a revelation of knowledge, or something like that. Um, but anyway, so I've heard Christian apologists say, well, if Jesus was predicting the end of the world or the coming of the kingdom, um, and it didn't happen, well, why would the gospel writers include that? That makes Jesus look bad. So he must have really been predicting the end of the world, which seems like a kind of stretch, or once again, kind of like intellectual or rhetorical gymnastics. Everyone always gets hung up about the end of the world. Modern day Christians, especially those who are obsessed with the idea of the rapture, etc., they think that everyone always thinks that the end times is the time they're living in. In a way, you could almost argue that's kind of arrogant or self-absorbed. You're so special, the end times are going to come in your lifetime. When, as I've talked about in the show before, um, even the book of Revelation doesn't seem to be talking about some massive and, apocalyptical event, or end of days coming way down the road, 2,000 years later. The early Christians thought Jesus was coming back pretty darn soon. And even the symbolism in the book of Revelation seems to be referring to um, the Roman Empire and the powers that be at the time. And it seems to be pointing in the direction that the writer of Revelation, as well as contemporary Christians at the time, the early Christians, thought that Jesus was coming back soon. And I think it's important to keep stuff like that in mind when you hear people ranting and raving about the end of the world. That people have been waiting for the end of the world for a very long time. There's always been war, there's always been natural disasters, and the bottom hasn't fallen out on us yet. But someday our species probably will end, but I doubt there'll be anything supernatural about it. But anyway, so I guess in conclusion, as I said, it's my feeling that although we don't have a time machine, the historical Jesus might have made such predictions. We don't know. It seems like a safe bet to assume that it may have been Jesus' predictions may have been, or at least referring to the temple, may have been a literary device employed after the fact, as the gospel writers were addressing their particular communities, some of which had, witnessed the razing of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and were in mourning, in a sense. But for those of you who are believers, I don't think there's anything wrong with you adhering to the more early dates that are closer to the eyewitness period. If it gives you comfort to place the dates earlier, and certainly there are conservative scholars who do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I think you still have plenty of room and validity in believing that Jesus may have actually made such predictions. But you know me, I'm a skeptic, but that doesn't mean that you have to be. But for me, today's episode wasn't about trying to beat up on religion or strip the magic away from the New Testament. For me, it was actually more of an excuse to talk about first century history and ancient history, which I'm fascinated by. And I guess I'll leave it on that note. So once again, this has been the Week in Doubt. Thank you to everyone for listening. As always, you can like the show on YouTube. You can just watch one of the vids and give it a like. You can rate us or subscribe on iTunes, rate us or subscribe through Podbean. You can like the Week in Doubt Facebook page, and any of that support would be greatly appreciated. So thank you.